All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for March 11th, 2024. Just a friendly reminder that we follow the Kubernetes code of conduct here, so just please be nice to each other. And also don't hesitate, if you want to say anything, you can drop it in chat or use Zoom's raise hand feature so we can make sure we get to you. With that, just a reminder that KubeCon is next week. Hopefully some of you are able to make it. It's in Paris this year. That means that the meeting for next week at least will be canceled, or I guess you could say rescheduled for those who are able to make it there in person. I think we have 4 or 5 gateway-related talks at this KubeCon. Can't remember the specifics. Maybe somebody can link them in Slack. Um, on the Tuesday before KubeCon, there's a Kubernetes Contributor Summit. I usually try and find time to meet up with other contributors, especially other Gateway API contributors there. So if you're able to make it and don't have an invite yet or anything like that, definitely let us know and we can try and get you in. Yeah, and yes, the last KubeCon we did, we ended up having meetings. Meetings is too strong a term. Meetups, I guess you could say, every day at KubeCon from 2 to 3 p.m. in the contributor lounge. If that's still an option this time, I think we'll probably do something similar. These are very informal, but a way to just kind of make more progress in person, face to face than we can asynchronously. So again, if anyone's going to be there, we'll try and post in Slack where we'll be at a minimum. We'll try and make sure all the maintainers are in one spot, and then whoever else can make it would be great. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Oh, actually, one question here. The meeting on the Monday after KubeCon, I know I personally won't be able to make it. Will others be around and interested in attending that one?
I think I should be, I'll be back. I cannot make representations as to how with it I will be because I will be horribly jet lagged almost certainly.
Right.
But I can give it my best shot at being here.
Yep. Awesome. Well, that sounds good enough for me. Thank you, Nick. So yes, so it will just be next week is canceled, and there will be some form of meeting immediately after KubeCon. I like Arco's idea to have a longer time slot at KubeCons. I thought the times were useful, so having a bit more time is probably helpful too. Maybe another thing to say is if people kind of want to suggest their ideas in Slack beforehand, then we can kind of reserve certain times for specific topics if somebody really wants to get to a specific gap or whatever, and we can have a focused discussion on that. But it's also entirely fine to have unfocused discussion about whatever comes up. That's fine too. Okay. With that, just a quick recap on where we are for 1.1. gRPC route is on track. I have a topic below on this. We actually need to get this, like everything passed on it. It's good to go. We just need to bump the API version. And this part is actually more complicated than you would think. And I bumped that down to a point below this so we can follow up on that later. Arco, I saw your comment here. Does that mean that Envoy Gateway likely supports this? We just need somebody to run the test to confirm it?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome, cool. So if anybody wants to do that, we even have a command. So that's awesome. Cool. And then conformance profiles, this is just left to a single PR now. And that is Mattia's PR to document how all this conformance works, and then we're good to go. So it looks like we're in good shape now for everything that is leaving experimental. Then targeting experimental, I think, Arco, you pushed some updates today on the GEP PR, is that correct?
I did. I have 3 things I want to discuss, if that's okay.
Yeah, that was great.
Cool. The first one is SAN, so subject alt name versus subject name, right? That's something you raised, Rob. So it looks like common CN has been deprecated. There was an RFC for it. I believe even Envoy doesn't support it. So I think that's something we sort of should, build consensus on, which is, should we continue with subject alt name or subject name as the field?
Yeah, I do think that subject name, like the more generic subject name, is probably, like you said, like it's supporting something that's deprecated at this point. I don't really feel that strongly on this one. Costin, it looks like you've got an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's deprecated to some extent, I mean, for HTTPS, and but I'm not entirely sure that subject name is deprecated as a subject name, and it's used in various places. I think even Kubernetes is using, GK is not GK, sorry, Kubernetes is using subject name in their certificates, and there are still quite a few cases where subject name is in use. I mean, MySQL and some few others. And I believe Envoy does support it as well. I mean, it's explicitly not the default and not for domain verification with SNI and domain name standard, but for as a custom option.
I see. So, Costin, I looked into Envoy. I couldn't find explicit field for common name. It just says subject all name. So I didn't dig in, but does that specify that does that handle common name as well?
I believe I saw somewhere common name. If it's not there, well, I mean, my point is that there are some use cases where some protocols are using the common name for custom verification, not HTTPS, but even in HTTPS case, not necessarily as a domain name. And if Envoy is missing it, probably can add it. I mean, it's definitely reflected in the export or the client certificate if you ask for it. And it's I can do a bit of research, but I just want to make sure we don't throw it away for the general case if necessary.
Cool. Yeah, I just want to make sure that all implementations can support it, and yeah, that's one of the pieces. So
Costin, did I get your GitHub username correct?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks.
I see.
Sorry, what were the other ones, Arco?
Yeah, so I think the second is, I think you had a good comment around typed field for subject name. So right above that, same place, Rob. And so I added a suggestion here. So instead of just having it as a flat string, right? You mentioned added as a type. So is this what you were hoping for, which is like type DNS or type IP address with a value?
Yeah, yeah,
So
exactly that.
Type and value, is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Type is the usual, effectively an enum, but not actually an enum. Like, yeah, basically an enum that has DNS, URI, and IP address. I think those are the options. I can't remember what else is in the RFC. But yeah, the idea, yeah, and then we can default it to DNS, so you only need to include it if it's not a host name. Yeah, and that's what we should do there. It should be optional, defaulted to DNS, and have the option to put in URI as well. I mean, URI is, as Rob said, the particularly important one, because that means that you can put spiffy identities in as an alternate name. I think that might be important.
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of kind of strange ones out there, but I feel like, I mean, we could just start with DNS and URI and not support others. I don't know, but as long as we have DNS and URI, and I completely agree that DNS should be default.
Sounds good. I'll do that. So yeah, and the last point is around just the field and the home. So I think we've spoken about this a while for a bit, which is either should the field be client validation, or should it be client as a top field with validation as a field within it, right? So I went ahead and I made that change. But I think for the record, we should record maybe why we made that change as to which fields do we see that will fit under client, but not under validation, and just sort of record that in this PR so that, yeah, when we revisit it, it can just make sense.
I'll admit I can't think of many, but I really like the style of, client and then any client settings. Like, if I'd rather the one level of indentation, even if there's only one thing, costs us very little and gives us the option to add more stuff in there later if we need it. Whereas if we put it client validation, then if we do ever need something that's also client configuration or something like that, then we end up having to have like multiple client blah 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 things at the top at that top level rather than having client and also I think are likely that the other side of the TLS config, the other thing that I've been thinking about with this is how do we configure the identity that a gateway should use for backend TLS policy. So if you as a client, and I would like that struct to look like client configuration, right? Like, so client is the top level one and configuration is the next level one. And so if we have client validation on the listener one, and we have client configuration on the client one, like the gateway as client one, then the structs look very similar. And I think that's what I'm aiming for here is even if we don't have the thing right now, I would rather leave the flexibility and have the ability for the structs to look similar, so that when there's a TLS stanza, it kind of looks the same. That feels like a better design principle to me than than trying to put everything in the top level. I 100% agree that generally you don't want to just leave things there in case you need them. But in this case, with the fact that we have a bunch of other TLS things that also may have client settings that may need to be configured, it feels like it's better to keep the shapes similar. Does that make sense, Arko?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
One for
I think Costin had his hand up.
Yeah, just on this topic, I agree with you that we should have more client settings. On the subject of client, how client identifies itself, how it proves identity to either as a backend or as a gateway or something else. It's probably useful to keep them as a bit more open. I mean, not necessarily TLS as a separate thing from JOTS, means another form of authentication. And not group them by TLS. That's what I'm saying by protocol. But yeah, as a structure, and that's something for later because in many cases, MTLS is end to end. It's very limited to point-to-point connection. You cannot really bypass, go through multiple gateways and do other stuff. JOTS and injecting JOTS and means another kind of form of authentication, including SPIFFE JOTS, which are a thing now. Maybe more flexible. They're completely.
I hear you, but I think in this case, I really want to keep us focused on the TLS thing. But I do think that and what I want is for the TLS stuff to look similar, the stanzas to look similar, whether they are on inside the listener at a top level inside the gateway, which we have not agreed that we will do. But like, if we wanted to do that, I would like that to look similar. And then and then for backend TLS policy, we can change backend TLS policy because it's not very well implemented yet. To also look similar, and that way all the TLS stanzas will sort of have a similar shape no matter where they are.
Yeah, sounds good. Just one sort of side. Yeah, I might be sidetracking, but other configuration like ALPN and curves and algos, do you see them live inside client or idly at the TLS level? If in case you add them in the future.
I think if they're a setting that, like, if they're a two-way setting where the client can specify some and the server can specify some, then they'll probably need to live in both. Like Cyphers is a good example there, right? Like maybe you might end up with, anytime you configure the client settings, you can configure the Cyphers. But most likely the first one that people will want is the server, because generally it's better to restrict on the server side and have the client be more open and let the negotiation happen, right? Like, but that's not to say we'll never need it. I think that probably we'll want to do it on the server side first. So yeah, the server struct will probably, I would guess that the server struct is more likely to grow, ALPN or other sort of settings earlier than the client structs.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah.
I want to add here that, for example, setting the ciphers and other stuff. We had many discussion in Istio and in Google about this. Usually, that's not something that a regular user is expected to do. It's something that some pair mesh multi-cluster global VPC setting where, for compliance reasons, you set some particular ciphers. So it may be better to leave it out of the API for now until we get more information about this.
Yeah, I'm not saying we put it in now. I'm saying that we need to make sure there's space for it in the API. That's all.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and as Arco said, like, I mean, I had a bit of a look at the Envoy Gateways, TLS policies and stuff like that, and there's a lot of settings in there already. So I can see why you're asking these questions, Arco, and it makes sense. And that is partly what I've been thinking about as well after I had a look at your policies. In the context of doing stuff with policy attachment, but it's been very relevant for TLS as well. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, folks. So yeah, I think looks like the only changes I need to do is the subject name changes and make it a type. So I'll hopefully get that done by today. So we can try.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for all the work on this. I think this one looks very close then. Yeah, thanks, Arco. All right, the next one up is session persistence. Grant, I don't know if you're on the call.
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, cool. I know you pushed some updates recently too, and I've lost track, but I remember thinking this one was just about good to go the last time I looked at it. I don't know if you have any more recent updates.
I think Gina brought up a topic about traffic splitting. So I had one update to that. I updated it as a follow-on commit. So it should be pretty easy to review that. Other than that, I don't think I have any major fundamental changes, and maybe about a week has been changing, as we do reviews. But there's a couple of loose threads hanging out. I don't, GitHub is kind of confusing. I feel like sometimes it's hard to keep track of some of the threads. I do have some loose ends, I think, that are waiting for, responses, or at least maybe confirmation that I am doing what is expected, or we at least have agreement on what I put up. So that's the only comment is just a couple of loose threads that I'd like to tie up. And I do think we're pretty close to, I guess, just another version of provisional. So I don't think we have to be perfect here, because I don't think we're not going to experimental yet. So I think there's still some room to keep revising.
And I think if I remember right, the only thing that is really blocking this between provisional and implementable is just the specifics on route level configuration, and that somebody can add separately. It's not even necessarily blocked on this merging, but it's a separate thing. I think that's the main outstanding item that prevents this from going directly to experimental or implementable. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. I've got the graduation criteria updated and the top of the GEP, and the only unanswered question or to-do item is about the route rule API. So following up with the edge cases, I think just better defining those behaviors. The override functionality, which I had one of the loose threads in there was about the route level API overriding a direct policy attachment, which is kind of, I feel like, somewhat new territory. At least I haven't seen any examples of that. And my curiosity was, should this be done in GEP 713 or what is it? Whatever, 626, the direct to policy
2648.
2648.
Ask me how I know.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the general rule that we've always gone by with policy attachment is that more specific beats least specific for things that are effectively defaulting. And so this is effectively defaulting here. If you're attaching a policy, you're defaulting the settings that are available inside the object. So if you have a setting inside the object, it will always win. And so I think that's sort of the guideline here is that if the object says something and there's some defaulting behavior happening, then whatever's in the object wins over the default always, because the user has explicitly specified something. It's the opposite for overrides, because that's the point of an override. But like, I do think that the more we work with policy attachment, the more I think that overrides should be used extremely sparingly. They are very much a escape hatch kind of deal, or should be used very, very, very carefully. Yeah.
I think this idea actually is a funny and weird edge case with how you've defined direct policy attachment in your most recent PR, Nick. Like you basically said that direct policy attachment cannot result in any changes to other resources that aren't directly targeted, which is actually like this model would actually meet that, in that the policy attachment is only targeting the service. It's that something else could essentially override that policy from about like the route, basically. Override default, like it's a little backwards, but I think it actually does fit in the guidelines that you've outlined or we've outlined. It's just,
I mean, it's me for now, because no, we haven't agreed. So the intent here is so I'm preempting the note that I just put in, but the intent behind sort of tightening in the definition of direct policy attachment is to say direct policy attachment is what happens when all you need to know about is a single object and the policy that attaches to it in terms of understanding what is going on, right? Like in this case, to understand what is going on, if you have, you have a policy, a backend LB policy that attaches to a service, and you've got some other setting that it inflicts that, it's kind of not really direct. Like maybe the policy itself might be direct attached, but the whole system is not, right? Like you need to know about the routes that mess with it and all that sort of stuff. And that means that you then have the same status problem as inherited policy. It's like, I actually was thinking about it yesterday. It's almost like the status problem for inherited policy is like the gateway API equivalent of non-polynomial time, and anything that creates the same that means that you need to know the status of more than one objects is effectively NP complete, right? Like you have to solve the same problem as you do for inherited policy that you do to understand the whole system. And it is super hard, so that's why I picked that, because NP is very hard. But yeah, so that's kind of the reason that I really want to dial in on the scope for direct policy attachments, because dialing in like that means that we conceivably might be able to graduate direct policy attachment before we solve the full how do I understand this entire system of policy objects. I mean, the answer to that may be, hey, you got to use gateway kettle, but like no, I don't know what that answer is yet, because again, NP. So yeah, like, and the idea here is to keep to try and say like direct policy attachment, because of these weird, like very specific rules, is now solvable in polynomial time, not in non-polynomial time.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, I think this is actually in a good state then. Grant, I think all you need from us is for anybody. Oh yeah, one heads up for any of Flynn, John, Keith on this call. There is some gamma, considerations here, so it would be great to get some kind of formal sign off from somebody who's more involved in the mesh side of the world. So yeah, just heads up, feedback would be very welcome. I also see Mike on this call. I didn't mention him specifically, but I think you also very clearly qualify. So yeah, feedback would be great.
Feel free to tag me or assign me on something if you want gamma relevant eyes on it.
Well, thank you for volunteering.
Sure, thanks.
Cool. Awesome.
So I haven't given this a proper review in some time. It is on my list, but I've also got a couple of slide decks I got to do, and some other stuff. So I'm doing my best to get to it, but this one is going to need a couple of hours, and I haven't had a couple of hours contiguous spare yet this week. So sorry.
So maybe what makes sense is I think this gap is largely in a state that's not going to change much. So whoever ends up doing this kind of follow-up PR, maybe they can just base it off of this PR even before it's merged, just so that we can have a quick follow-up for this.
Yes, good idea.
Cool.
Sorry, what do you mean exactly by that, Rob? Like do it in the
So-
same PR?
No, well, it could be, but what I meant by that is base it off. So basically, take the fork from your branch that is this PR and then create another PR that has an additional commit or two that resolves this. Like not try and
Okay.
add even more to your PR, but just have a separate PR that just resolves this last bit.
Okay. Yeah, that makes
That's all.
sense. Yeah, I had one question, because I do want to talk about this API at KubeCon. So it would be awesome if I could get it merged this week. So my question was, how likely do you think that is? And if it doesn't get merged, can I still talk about the API that I've, I guess, drawn up in its provisional state?
Uh,
My feeling is it's
I would-
reasonably quickly, but and you should totally talk about it even if it's not merged. Just caveat it with, hey, this is still in review, but I'm pretty confident it's going to be very similar. Sorry,
yeah,
Rob.
I'd echo everything that Nick said. I will definitely do what I can to give the sign off on this one, but do want to make sure that you know, Mike, Nick, others have had a chance to look at it. I would really, really love that this to be merged in time, because I know you've got a great talk coming on this one. But yeah, like you said, it would not be the first KubeCon talk with something that is about to merge but not yet merged. So that's also okay. But would love to, you know, you've been working on this for a long time, so would love to get it across the finish line before KubeCon if we can.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks.
Cool. All right, the last one is Gateway merging, which ironically has not merged. Yeah, this Dave, I don't know if you're on this call. You are. Okay, awesome. So I left a barrage of comments just before the meeting that I'm sure you haven't had a chance to read, so sorry. But I really did get to this one. I know others, this has broad support. I have concerns. I'm hesitant about it, but I do recognize that, you know, a broad swath of the community wants this and is already doing it. So my main concerns are, how can we do it a little bit more safely, maybe, kind of, sort of.
Looks like you didn't hit-
Not. Oh, I got a bunch of pending comments. That's even worse. These have been pending for far too long. I'm sorry. So preview of the comments that I'm about to send. Yeah. So overall, my concerns are just that we're basically removing some guardrails, such as the max number of listeners that can be on a gateway. I mean, we're not doing that directly, but we are saying, well, you can have infinite child gateways, and so by extension, you can have infinite listeners if you support gateway merging. And so you know, and then the cross-domain bits also are, cross namespace bits are a little concerning to me, because it basically means domain delegation across namespaces, and maybe I can't remember, is it basically first namespace to claim a domain wins in that case? Is there, or does that question even make sense?
If that is the case, sorry, you go.
There's no opinions on that.
Okay. Okay. I think we definitely want to avoid first one in wins semantics, because that was a really crap user experience for Ingress. Yeah, Gosden.
But we don't have pretty much any good alternative, unfortunately. I mean, it's a very complicated issue about how do you assign names to gateways securely, and you know, with DNS owner not being unhappy about it. I'm not sure. I mean, it's orthogonal because that's a problem already. It's something that you can do with even with single gateways. But I think we will need some thinking about it, because it's going to create problems with external. I was looking at external DNS, for example, and they also kind of have no regard for namespaces, boundaries, ownership, and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And it's repeating mistakes that we already made twice. I mean, both Ingress and Istio, and probably a few others in the call made this mistake. But it's not related with merging. I mean, that's a completely orthogonal problem. That's how do you grant a namespace to a cluster and namespace? Not only namespace, but also cluster is a problem, because not any cluster in the mesh or whatever it's entitled to own that particular name, domain name.
Yeah, I'd argue that although this isn't related to, it's not completely new with merging. It is certainly exemplified by merging, in the sense that, well, I thought we actually had a reasonable model with the gateway to route delegation of the gateway says, here's, your wildcard of iClaim star.example.com, and I delegate it to this namespace or set of namespaces, right? Like that was the model. And then once you allow gateway merging, and especially if you allow gateway merging across namespace boundaries, then you kind of lose that.
Unless
you lose that little bit of guardrail.
Unless you
Unless
don't.
there's
yeah, you'd have to have like a host name thing on the sort of, I know that right now we've got a like allow merging from or something like that standard in there. It's been a little while since I looked at this, but you'd have to have the equivalent thing of like a host name thing on the listener to produce a similar properties where, if you try and merge a gateway that has foo.example.com into a merged gateway that only lists like star.bar.com, then that will fail, right? Like, because you're trying to claim an extra thing or something like that. Like there's a way to cut that down and make it so that you can't increase the scope of domain names claimed by the merged gateway. And then that means that you need to be explicit about what domain names the gateway that you're going to merge into is claiming. Yes, Costa.
Yeah, I mean, my point I was trying to say with don't, it's there is no reason to allow merging across multiple namespaces. I mean, at least with the allow routes, the mesh admin can put RBAC rules and only grant permission to trusted, people, DNS owners or whatever, to a particular domain, and that's what DNS external DNS is also doing. It has a flag that specifies a specific namespace where it's going to sync from Kubernetes to external DNS. Istio is kind of recommending the same thing. I mean, if you want security and you want protect name, put all the service entries in Istio system or in a dedicated namespace. And with allow routes, that works very well. So it will be ideal if we start, at least for starters, we'll restrict merging to same namespace. I don't know. That's my
John about that, because I'm pretty sure one of the cross namespace requests was from him.
So I would guess it's going to be very similar to the use cases for allowed routes on listeners. Some people want to be able to lock that down, and other people specifically want to be able to not lock that down and have it be magic and have everything just work. And that's why we ended up with the structure that we had, is that some people want to be able to say, no, I'm delegating some portion of a multidimensional space that's like, sliced by host name or some other thing. And other people want to explicitly be able to say, no, this is open slather and you can do whatever you like. And, any host name can be claimed onto this gateway. Some people are going to want maximum magic. And unfortunately, we need to be able to support both of those use cases, which is, again, one of the reasons why this API has taken us 4 years, right? Like, is that, we keep running into this sort of thing where, it's like, well, some people really want this to be properly secure, but other people specifically want it to be insecure. And that is how they want the thing to behave. Like, and we got to handle both.
Well, they can use Ingress always. If they want insecure, there is no.
Yeah, sure.
Fair
They
point.
can use if you want insecurity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of on that note, I did want to, apparently I haven't submitted these yet, but I did want to at least consider alternatives. I'm not saying we should do any of these, but there I wanted to at least understand if any of these alternatives could solve the problem. If not, why they couldn't, like just trying to fully understand the problem statement. Like if the cross namespace one is a big deal, which I think it is, then we really need to think long and hard. Every single time we've crossed namespace boundaries in Gateway API, it's taken a lot of time to get that relationship right.
If only there was some sort of thing built into the API server that could grant referential security settings, Rob.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah.
So I am referring to the thing that Rob is going to talk about in a minute, which is the I can't remember what it's called, referential something.
Referential authorization.
That's the one. Referential authorization kept. So that is an upstream thing that will let things claim referential access in a similar way to reference grant, but built into the API server. So once that's available, then that may make this problem go away, and we won't have to have, you don't need things like allowed routes because the API server can do it for you.
Yep.
Yes,
that will be good fun.
Yes. So Arco made a good point in the thing is that the big use case for merging is that it lets you have a gateway that holds the infrastructure, and then users create gateways that target that thing so that they can set specific settings. Basically, it lets them add in listeners. Yes, that is the use case that people want. Is people want to be able to add in listeners to a defined gateway that holds the infrastructure. That's why people want this. And again, that does mean that you can't have, you're having infinite listeners and stuff like that. And that is going to be a problem for the implementations to have to solve. Like there's only a certain amount that we can solve that in the API.
But I don't think it's like 65,000 listeners.
I mean, you're gonna run into memory problems in every data plane. You get that many listeners for sure. You're gonna be ooming all the time. Like
on demand is a thing in Envoy now, so it is possible to have millions of listeners. It's not really. I mean, Knative is doing it and others.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not unusual to have over 1,000 listeners, 2,000 listeners in a Knative cluster.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I guess at a certain point, every implementation then needs to document, this is the max number of listeners we support. Anything beyond that at your own risk, or we stop, I think most implementations today can support our max right now, which is 64. But yeah, as you increase that to infinity, then everyone needs to define their own max, which I guess is not new with scalability. It's just, yeah. And one last thing before I hand it over to Costin, I did want to call out Arco's suggestion for gateway class level config. I meant to include that in the alternatives worth considering because I do really like how Envoy Gateway does that. So I do like that approach. Costin, go ahead.
Yeah, I like that approach too as well, by the way. So in terms of max listeners and this, I mean, I don't think we are mandating that all gateways are merged into a single physical gate or load balancer deployment, whatever you want to call it. We still want implementation to have the flexibility to put all the gateways from all the clusters, from all tenants in a single massive multi-tenant gateway implementation, like with millions of listeners, like Google can support in some cases. And that's not unheard of. I mean, there are many in Cloudflare, Google, a lot of vendors support massive numbers of virtual hosts and with on-demand. But we should also be able to let them split them, create one gateway for listeners if they choose to. So even if they merge somehow the gateways, they can still choose how they deploy it, how many deployments, how many servers, how many locations, where the servers run, and all that.
I mean, the thing I was going to say is it's not only the number of listeners, it's also the combinatorial complexity of the fact that every listener has multiple routes, every route has multiple backends, so if you allow the more listeners you allow, the more combinatorial complexity problems you conceivably could have. But again, your point is fair, Costin, that hey, maybe your implementation is good at handling that sort of combinatorial complexity problem, and it's not a problem. But the reason why we limited it to start with was to make it so, hey, we're at least going to make it so that you can't footgun this to start with, right? Like, you know, if it turns out, I mean, practically the other reason to have a limit per object is maximum size limits in etcd. You know, like when you go over the maximum record size limit, your record will be arbitrarily truncated at some point, right? Like, which is terrible, right? So that's why there are lots and lots and lots of limits in you know, in the actual objects. And that's, you know, we have had many queries from people being like, why is it only 8 of this? Why is it only 32 of this? And the answer is always because we're worried about the multiplicative size of a thing that has 64 listeners, each with 8 routes, each with, you know, however many backends we allow you. That is bigger than you can fit into etcd without going and messing with your etcd settings, which almost no one will let you do because it's a terrible idea. Yeah. So, and that, like, it's just, yeah, it's about the other reason there is about the size of the record, right? Like,
Yeah, very relevant to the endpoints to endpoint slice discussion, where I think we around 10,000 endpoints per service, it would just stop working for you. That was really fun. Anyway, but we have lots more to get to, and I do want to time box this one. Good discussion. I will make sure to actually hit submit on my comments immediately after this meeting. But thank you, Dave, for pushing that forward, and for everyone else who's already reviewed it. Very interested. I think a lot of the discussion going forward just has to be about how or if we can make this safe. Yeah. Okay, Candace, I don't know, are you on the call? You had something like in the for next up, and I brought it down, this one.
Yes, I'm on the call.
Cool.
So you did. Thought I brought it up last time, but maybe I didn't. I think I just introduced it last time.
Oh, sorry. I guess it maybe just never got, okay, that's
No,
fine.
I did move it up to the parking lot area because we didn't talk about it very long.
Got it.
So and Mike Morris commented on this as well. So I was just trying to see how many implementers, if I don't know how many implementers are on the call today, have any interest in the ability to use multiple instances of Gateway API on the same cluster. So for, you know, a case where you want to bring up one version while the other version is still running, and maybe so like a blue-green installation, bring up one version, test it for a while, and then, you know, dispense with the old version so you can move the new version in. That's one use case that I thought of. Another use case that's applicable for us and also for Mike Morris, it seems, is when you might need to designate one instance for one purpose and another instance for other purposes. Or for us, the use case there is we might want one for mesh and one for Gateway API on its own. You know, the classic Gateway API, for example. So I was wondering how many people are interested in this, whether any implementers are interested in this, whether we've talked about this in the past or anything.
Yeah, it sounds like there's lots of interest. Maybe Dave, you want to go first?
Yeah, because routability isn't in the like merged in or available, there's no way to do cluster local gateway without custom gateway classes for different implementations, which then means, like, for example, for Contour, we actually deploy 2 different Contour instances to the same cluster. And they each has a unique gateway class, and we target the different routes, like cluster local routes, to the cluster local gateway class, as an example. Ideally, we don't need to do that like on a per implementation approach, and long term that could be done via the Gateway API directly, but that's kind of we kind of expect that for implementations now, that you can install two things twice and then tweak the underlying implementation. For example, like change the service type to like cluster IP and so forth. That's all I had.
Yeah. The presence of the controller name string in gateway class is specifically designed to enable that use case. I think there's two sort of questions that like I think Mike asked it as well that are not 100% clear to me. So there's two things that you could be meaning here. Like one, do you want to run multiple controllers, multiple implementations in the same cluster using the same version of the CRDs? Yep, totally doable. That's what controller name is for. That's what gateway classes are for. You know, everything that we have ever written is about an implementation reconciling a gateway class, but it does not have to be one implementation equals one gateway class. We've also written that you can have one implementation handles multiple gateway classes. That is up to your implementation, right? Can you have multiple versions of the CRDs? No, you can't. That's how CRDs work. Unless you can't have multiple versions, of the CRD YAMLs. You can have if we include multiple versions in the sort of install YAMLs, then there's some slightly cleverer stuff you can do, but you can't, practically you're never going to be able to have Gateway 1.0, Gateway API 1.0 and Gateway API 1.1 installed in the same cluster because they will conflict and override each other. Rob wants to talk about something associated with that in a minute, but the idea here is like we have a hard limitation based on custom how CRDs work that you've got to have only one version in the cluster. But aside from that, having multiple implementations that each reconcile multiple gateway classes, 100% designed and intended in the API. That's it for me, Rob.
Yeah, agree with everything you said. And also the segue into my next topic, which is very related to what can run in the cluster at the same time in terms of CRD versioning. But I'll just say that, like, from Google's perspective, at least, we're investing in many different gateway implementations. And with the idea that they will run in the same cluster. So certainly that is a goal, and has been a core part of the API. So definitely want to enable that to work. And on a related note, we want to ensure that the CRDs work for as long as possible, so that a controller can target a specific API version and support 5 different versions of CRDs and not have to have a direct mapping between Contour version X and Gateway API version Y. Like, it should be a broader range than that. Not to pick on Contour or anybody, but just any implementation. That's all I've got. Costin, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so on the second topic, I think I agree with everyone. I mean, JK and Istio also support multiple classes, and that's probably the right way to do it. On the first topic about Canary and being able to do blue-green, we had a lot of discussions about this in Istio, and Mitch in particular was very interested in this. The conclusion is that in general, we prefer to have the vendor, operator, whoever is operating the gateway to handle this kind of transitions for the gateway deployment or implementation. But there is also some desire to be able to canary the config changes, like you have a canary HTTP route that only applies to a particular version. Now, this gets very complicated pretty soon. We have this ability in Istio on a per CR to put some annotation to specify this is a canary resource, and as such the HTTP route or policy will only apply to the canary gateway or canary Istio or some other combination. It's very important to reduce blast radius, because if you put a bad HTTP route, you can mess up your entire production at once. And that's different from canarying the actual deployment of the gateway. It's about canarying the HTTP route itself. And probably for authorization policies and other things, it will be pretty similar. I mean, a bad config in authorization shuts down the entire cluster immediately. But again, it's pretty complicated and probably better for each individual vendor to do it on its own because probably it impacts other config deployment. In Istio, we have this capability. It's rarely used. I don't think anyone, probably maybe 1 or 2 users have used it, and probably only few know about it. But it's super important for reliability and for production cases. In practice, most people just have a canary cluster or they test their configs and they are happy with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think originally when we were thinking about this sort of thing, we anticipated that at the very least, people would probably have a canary gateway where you know, that exposes all the same services and stuff like that, and you just have it available on a separate, effectively IP address. But anyway, we've gone a bit far afield. I think we should time box this and move on to the next thing because we do have a couple of other things we want to talk about.
Yeah. Candace, did that answer your question?
Yeah, so the summary is that it should be available. It may or may not be available in different implementations.
Yeah,
It's
I
not
would
something.
say if you run into an implementation that does not work well with other implementations in the same cluster, that's probably a bug, and we should follow up on that. But that's not that's not the goal anyway.
Well, it was more about having 2 instances of the same vendor in the cluster. Did I
Oh, I see.
misrepresent my question?
I see. Yeah. I mean, that I guess is implementation specific. I would expect that to be fine,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. So
yeah.
The intended way that people do that is that you have as part of the config for your implementation, you can change the controller name that it looks for in gateway classes.
Mhm.
One, and then you can have multiple gateway, like different gateway classes with different controller names, and then that's how the implementations know which gateway classes to pick up. So like for Contour, it defaults to like projectcontour.io/contour as the controller name, but there's a way that there's a config setting you can set. So you can have like projectcontour.io/internal and projectcontour.io/external, and then you create a gateway class that has that as an internal one that has /internal as the controller name and an external one that has /external as the controller name. Then you've got 2 implementations that have that roll up to different gateway classes. And they're completely separate, right? Like, yeah, and they can have different config, they can be different versions. If you wanted to canary them, you could put, /version number after at the end of the controller name. That's what the controller name is sort of intended for, is to be able to slice things like that and be able to run multiple implementations in a cluster and have that implementation pick its own controller name. Does that make sense?
Yes. The next thing I might like to talk about is the case where you might have one instance for mesh and one for other gateway API stuff, but when you want to make sure that there isn't an extra hop between the instance for gateway for external connections and for mesh.
We did spend some time talking about the interaction between sort of north-south use cases and east-west use cases, but I think we left that sort of on the table to begin with because there was because there was enough complexity in just figuring out how the mesh stuff worked. I could be wrong though. Mike is putting his
yeah. We went
back
and forth on this for a long time. Basically, it's a really tricky thing where from some perspectives, the ideal UX is to have your ingress implementation in north-south be aware of things that have been configured in your mesh. But that's basically impractical unless you have a single implementation that controls both the ingress and the mesh. When you start mixing implementations, if you have even just like within a single vendor, like a managed service mesh and a separate managed cloud load balancer product, it really starts to become impractical to do that. So where we've mostly ended up is it seems like many or most implementations default to having their north-south load balancer do endpoint routing. So basically routing to the pod is unaware of necessarily any east-west configuration, gamma style. But what you can do is if you write an HTTP route attached to your service that you're using for Gamma style east-west, because you can have multiple parent refs on HTTP route, if you actually desire to have identical configuration, you can specify a second parent ref and target that ingress gateway. So that extensibility is an option. I think in practice we've found, or not found, but we like hypothesize that many ingress routes will have slightly different configuration. You may have additional expectations with like JWT auth-z or different tolerances for timeouts or failovers or things like that, such that it probably makes more sense to have a separate route for ingress. So it's not necessarily a problem, and it kind of lends itself better to that initial state where you're doing endpoint routing by default anyway. I could probably break this up in the issue that I think our automation closed because we had left it open so long. But it's basically like we can't prescriptively do integrated service routing. Some projects, I think like Linkerd by like has a way where they like add a header to some ingress implementations in an attempt to do like mesh aware service routing and deploy a proxy next to an ingress. That's not practical for a lot of integrations where you have an ingress in a position like a cloud or something like that, where you can't, like any out of cluster thing where you can't just deploy a sidecar next to it. Whew. Sorry, it's
Yeah,
mouth.
that could
Thank you.
definitely benefit.
Thanks.
Yeah. No, that's very useful. I would appreciate if one of you wants to write that up on and reopen the issue around this, because it does seem like it's still very relevant.
Yes, and we'll put it as
yeah.
frozen if need be. Like,
Yeah.
we do have that
Yeah.
tool available. It is okay. We just like to not having the stalebot, sort of pop up every now and again and be like, hey, this is stale, you haven't talked about it in a while, is generally useful. So that's why we don't like to do frozen very often. I think I know you're about to say we are out of time.
Yeah, exactly. I'm out of time. I will owe everyone an update on this discussion around gRPC route to standard instead of discussing it here. Ref grant update. You can just see it at KubeCon. I was trying to give a preview, but it'll be at KubeCon, at Contrib Summit, or the main session, whichever. We can talk more there. And then I think this is just a reminder to look at your PR, Nick. Is that
Yes, please.
correct? Okay.
Again, like I would really like to get this merged as soon as possible. It is the other reason why I haven't reviewed the session persistent ones. Sorry, Grant, but I really want to get this in. So yeah, if everyone could please have a check of it. I do have a couple of things I've got to update today while you're knocked off. But yeah, if you could all have a look at it tomorrow after I get a chance to make some changes, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.